There's one topic that I've been meaning to go over, and actually it's been brought to my attention just recently. There is a huge amount of argument about whether or not you can run a blow-off valve on a Civic Type R. Yes, you can. Will it hurt the engine? No. There's arguments back and forth as to why it will. Those who argue that it will do not understand a modern ECU. They do not understand how it works. They read something online and they think, well, this happened, so that has to be this car. It does not work that way. So Civic Type R, there are 3 reasons that you can do it. 1, it has a solenoid. The solenoid activates to relieve boost pressure only when necessary. 2, it has fuel shut off when you're on deceleration. 3, the ECU uses closed loop. What does that mean? And what does fuel shutoff mean? Fuel shutoff is pretty simple. When you let off the throttle and you're coasting down, the car just turns off the fuel and shuts off the fuel going into the engine. Closed loop means that regardless of the values that it sees coming from the sensors, it can continue to adjust or change fuel. Open loop means that it sees a set values, and that set value at that point, that calculation at that point is an expected amount of fuel, and during open loop, a car will not change from that value. So if it wanted 300 grams a second reading, and it was in open loop, if it sees 300 grams from the sensors, that's all the fuel it's going to put in. If it's open closed loop, it can add or remove fuel from that point. So I use that gram a second calculation because it's a calculation that's used for the mass airflow, voltage versus grams. And the fuel is done by weight, not volume, which is why we say grams. It's weight, how much it weighs, which is why when you're trying to calculate ethanol concentration, since ethanol and gasoline don't weigh the same, you can't just calculate by how many gallons against how many gallons, because gallons are volume, not weight. If you had it in pounds or how many, if you do the exact calculation by weight, it works out just fine. So, how does the mass airflow work? Why is it important? The mass airflow has what's known as a hot wire. A hot wire basically means the sensor heats a wire inside of it, and then as air goes over this wire, it cools the wire down. Well, the way the mechanism is it heats the wire back up to that temperature it wants it at, and the amount of required energy to heat it is translated and sent back to the computer, and the computer then puts the according amount of fuel in the calculation. That's how a mass airflow works. It's also known as a metered air flow. It is not a manifold absolute pressure sensor. That is a MAP sensor. MAF and MAP are 2 totally different things. Cars that do not run a MAF sensor run a MAP sensor and a speed density tune. The Civic Type R runs what's known as a mass airflow tune. So you have mass airflow, speed density. Those are your 2 forms of tuning. So now let's get past that and now that you know how mass airflow basically works, we're going to get into why the Civic Type R actually can run a blow-off valve, even though it has a mass airflow sensor, and then we'll get into why older cars can't. So, let's get into the operation. Let's start very beginning with the solenoid. The solenoid is here. It takes vacuum from the manifold, and during the appropriate times, depending on whether you have a diverter valve recirculates it, or a blow-off valve, it will vent it. Now, why is this important? Because you don't want it to vent all the time, which is part of the reason. But here's what happens. When you vent a system like this, the mass airflow, and you vent that air between the turbo and the engine, this meter reads the increased airflow, but the car's not actually getting it, so it ends up running rich. So why does this work? Part of the reason, as I said, closed loop. The computer continuously adjusts. It sees a rich condition and then pulls fuel back out. Now there is a slight delay, which some of you notice running a blow-off valve. The car has a little bit of a drivability difference. It's not horrible. It's just it's easy to get used to. So how does the solenoid work? The solenoid takes it, so how does it keep it closed? How do we keep it from opening when we don't want it to open? Well, this vacuum line goes to the turbo, runs through this piping, through the solenoid, which is 2 lines, runs it back through the other line to the blow-off valve, or, well, in my case, blow-off valve. In many other cases, diverter, or some people have a blow-off valve over here. And that boost pressure now keeps it shut. Well, why do you need that? Because the spring inside a blow-off valve or diverter valve is only supposed to be about the equal of idle vacuum. Idle vacuum is usually around in ratings of INHG. The word's not coming to my brains right now, but like the Civic Type R has 19 to 20 INHG, which is about 10 PSI. All right? 10 PSI of spring pressure is not enough to stay shut during boost, which is why they route it that way. So during boost, it does that. So when it's not in boost, this hose, this line is closed. This line gets closed, and then it allows the vacuum from the manifold here to go through the solenoid and to the blow-off valve and open it. Well, this is important because it doesn't open all the time, and it does not stay open during off throttle. Partial throttle driving, there's a lot of times that it doesn't even open. So that reason is one of the reasons that when you're driving, you're not as affected as you would be in an older car between that, the closed loop, and a fuel shutoff, and the solenoid being one of the biggest parts of it. If you have a blow-off valve, do not bypass that solenoid. I can promise you it will misfire at very low RPM. So if you're coasting down to say 1500 in traffic and you hit the throttle, and it's going to misfire, and that's because it's flooded. The air fuel ratio gets to like 10 to 1 because it stays open when it shouldn't, because the solenoid is controlled by the ECU. The ECU knows better than you. Trust me when I tell you that. So that keeps that shut when you don't really need it. If you just have it bypassed, anytime you reach the equal vacuum to spring pressure, it opens when you don't want it to open. Now, so why is it an issue at wide open throttle on other cars? Well, also if you bypass it, it's going to be an issue at wide open throttle. You're going to see 10 to 1 or more between shifts, but because it's direct injection, it's blown right out of the cylinders. So you can kind of get away with it. But if it's port injection, here's where the nightmare comes in. Port injection, the valve's closed, and the port injection will spray, and it will have fuel left over after the valve sitting there, and will flood the engine, and you will get, when you step back in the throttle, you already have a bunch of fuel inside the intake manifold, flooding the engine. You're stepping on the throttle. Now, because you're flooding and misfiring, the vacuum's off, so the reading through the mass airflow is wrong. So then you're throwing even more fuel at it, because between the map sensor and the mass airflow sensor, it's just going haywire. Let's just leave it at that. I'm not going to get into all the exact science of it, but the bottom line is, in an older car that doesn't have a solenoid and doesn't have closed loop, it doesn't have fuel shutoff, no, you cannot run a blow-off valve. You have to run a diverter valve so that when you pump the air back through the system, you're not drawing a bunch more past the mass airflow. When you pump that air back through here, the rate of air passing over the mass airflow is not as great as to where the blow-off valve, when it opens, it just continues that air. That turbo continues to move that air through like a recirculating effect, which gives it a very high reading, which causes it to flood. And again, this does not happen on a Civic Type R. You do get a momentary rich, but I'll think about the worst I've seen was like 12 to 1 for half a second. So that's not going to hurt anything. You're not flooding anything. You're not causing detonation. You can run a blow-off valve on a Civic Type R. But now here's the best question. Is it needed? No, it's not needed. It's not needed. But in my scenario, I have it because I have the Garrett turbo, and the Garrett turbo does not function without a blow-off valve. It does not have a recirculation valve. The EFR turbos do. But thankfully, because the way the modern ECU functions, we can do this. We can put a Garrett turbo that has an internal gate but no internal diverter valve like the EFR turbos. So those are the reasons why this car can function with a blow-off valve without causing damage. The worst thing that happens, and I know this is going to sound, it's stupid, but if you're one of those guys that taps the throttle a little to kind of find your clutch position as you're getting ready to go, you might stall. So other than some hurt feelings or some embarrassment, that's the worst thing that's going to happen to you guys. Trust me, I know I did it because that's how I get going normally. So I had to adjust that a little bit. And when you're shifting, the drivability is a little bit different. Not bad, but a little bit of a scaling adjustment wipes it right out. Now, it doesn't help with the free revving stall. That can happen because when you free rev, you can pop the blow-off valve open and there's no load on the car to continually push the motor. So yeah, it might stall in free rev condition, but if that's the worst of it, guys, I mean, like I said, it doesn't flood the engine. It doesn't cause misfires like in old cars. You don't get detonation. The trims don't get scrambled on the ECU. There is no real harm running a blow-off valve on a Civic Type R. Now that you know that, but also there's no real benefit unless you have a big turbo. So, and I can't confirm or prove that the Bumba diverter valve flows more. I cannot tell you if the actual diverter valve on the P600 or RS550 needs to be upgraded, but I would think that if it needed to, it would have been done. So you cannot, I'm not saying you can't, but it's havoc to try to take an engine like this that doesn't have a recirculation feature and put it back into there. There's just no room on this type of scenario. So besides the guys who want real big power, you're not going to care about if I free rev it, will it stall occasionally? You're not going to care. So thanks for watching. Now you know, yes, you can run a blow-off valve.